Hi, welcome to session 2 of the second topic of the semester, the European discovery, conquest, and colonization of America. So, this is session 2. And what we're going to do in this session, as I indicated in the last session, in the first session, is that we're now going to explore the rise of mercantilism in the 1400s, which was really the first international economic system that we know of, again, of world history. So, this is a process that started back in the 1200s, if you recall, with the journey of Marco Polo to the Far East in the late 1200s, in which he brought spices, he brought silks, gold, he brought teas and other products to Europe. And when that happened, he initiated, without knowing, of course, the future repercussions of his journey, but he initiated really the rise of international trade because, as I mentioned in the last session, once we move into the 1300s, the European merchants, particularly Italian merchants and some Portuguese, are beginning now to send more and more expeditions of merchants are traveling now through the Mediterranean Ocean and trying to get the spices from other merchants, perhaps from the Middle East, who in turn obtain the spices, of course, from the peoples of India, from merchants, from growers again of those spices from India. And so there's going to be a trade taking place throughout the 1300s, in which the spice trade dominated. Again, the connection, the commercial exchange, the connection between the different civilizations of the old world. This is what really is bringing people together, commercially speaking, and is allowing the Europeans to, again, engage in the import of those goods, and then the European merchants are, commercializing with those products inside of Europe, and there's going to be a great market all over Europe for spices, for reasons I already explored. And that, of course, led to innovations in navigation technologies. The merchants in Europe, the Portuguese particularly, wanted to accelerate the pace of trade, and they wanted to avoid all of the hassles of going again through the middleman, going all the way to the Middle East, that is to say, and they really wanted, to improve their vessels, their navigation, their vessels, in a way that they will begin to explore bodies of water in the Atlantic Ocean around the west coast of Africa, because their idea was to circumvent Africa, go around Africa, and reach the Far East for the spices again. So there's what the technological revolution I explained in the first session. In navigation, that is to say, the Portuguese are pioneering that revolution, and they're becoming the first explorers, so to speak, of new waters, new lands, and they're charting those waters. They're creating maps as accurately as they can at that point. But their idea, again, is to increase the pace of trade. So trade is the engine in history that is pushing, in this case, Europeans out of Europe to begin to, again, explore the world around them. In this case, they're interested in navigation because of the trade, because they want to bring cargoes of spices from the Far East and perhaps other products, of course, back to Europe, and increase, again, this commercial revolution that had started back with Marco Polo in the late 1200s, and in the 1300s is accelerating this commercial revolution. So new technologies were needed. So we talked about that. And of course, at the end of session 1, I mentioned that as the Portuguese are really exploring in the 1400s and starting in the 1430s, all the way to the end of that century, the Portuguese, they have a mission, again, is to reach India. So they're every year sending expeditions, south of Africa and the west coast, and they're trying to get as farther south as possible. And so they're pretty much charting unknown territories as they go, and then they come back, provide a report, and so on and so forth. So again, there's going to be a sort of race to the Far East as to who's going to reach the India, the spices, first before anybody else. But what I mentioned in the last session is that it is precisely. Let me put here the map or the outlines, so we can now begin where we actually stopped. Okay. It is that by the 1400s, commercial exchange, those trading networks that had been built in the past since Marco Polo, that connected merchants in Europe, merchants in the Mediterranean Ocean, in what we call Southeastern Europe, and then the Middle East as well, going all the way to India and China. There were already a network of commercial exchange in which long distance trade was already occurring at a faster and faster rate. What we're going to see is the emergence of mercantilism. That is, that those trading networks were really evolving into an economic system itself. It was not just trade in which people were trading goods back and forth, but that the world that in the old world, that is to say, the old world meaning again Europe, Middle East, Asia, etc., was becoming more and more interconnected economically. I mean, not to the point that what today we will call, for example, an interconnected economy. Of course, as today, like we got an international economy. Of course, it is true, but the first steps towards an international economy, if you will, the stepping stones, the initial stages of what today we will call simply an international economy, were established during the 1400s. And back then, people referred to this international economy as mercantilism. Okay, mercantilism. So what is mercantilism? Let me just elaborate rather quickly here some of the features or main principles of mercantilism, and how mercantilism started really changing the society, the economy, and even some of the political structures of Europe. So we cover, for example, in the first session, feudalism. We talked about feudalism, how feudalism, the economic system of feudalism, that divided Europeans between lords and commoners, or lord protectors and clients, and so on and so forth. That was a system that governed Europe for centuries, since the 5th century, after that about 450 AD, all the way to this time. Again, European society, the European economy was still very feudal. But with mercantilism, as we'll see, this is going to start changing very rapidly. Okay, so let me first explain what mercantilism is, and then we are going to examine the changes that are transpiring in Europe, that is moving Europe slowly but surely away from feudalism, and is moving Europe very gradually as well towards a new system that over time, by the 1600s, is going to be called capitalism. Okay, so again, we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. But first and foremost, what is mercantilism? Well, mercantilism was an international economy based on trade. That is to say, the trading of cargo and merchandise. Okay, merchandise had become very valuable. So in order to create wealth, people simply traded merchandise with each other that merchants could actually sell in their own region. Merchandise that was not produced locally, that is to say, that was of great demand, merchants will now try to get that merchandise from abroad, from another place, from another continent, from the other end of the world, in order to bring it to your own region, to your own city, to your own town, your own kingdom, etc., and try to create a market not to create the market, but trying to actually create an enterprise from that, of course, a business venture. So I just explained spices, for example, okay, in Europe. So there was a great demand for spices. So how do you create wealth if you're a merchant, let's say in Venice or any of those Italian, cities? Uh, well, you get the spices. You invest in a journey, an expedition, and try to again buy a load of spices, bring it to Europe, and sell it at higher price. There you have it. Of course, you have to engage in trade. Okay, so trading commodities or consumer products in a world market. Mercantilism also brought the idea that the world was becoming a marketplace. Okay, it was becoming a marketplace. That uh, what people will buy in the local market didn't have to be just products produced locally. That there was also the possibility of people finding products from other regions of the world. Okay, so when you go to the local market in your town, you will find the products of the world. You'll find a world market, that is to say. Okay, merchants are creating the first steps towards that. Today, of course, we're so accustomed to go to the local, supermarket and just find a wide variety of different products coming from different regions of the world. Think of, for example, when you're buying olive oil or etc. Any product, just choose which country you want it from. Of course, so we're so accustomed to that now, but back in the 1400s, this was becoming more and more a reality. Slowly, of course, this is not all of a sudden people are going to be overwhelmed with so many products from overseas, but slowly but surely, this is becoming more and more apparent. The world was becoming a marketplace. There are producers of products which find consumers in another part of the world. So from one part of the world, there will be producers of silks, like in China, or producers of spices in India, but the consumers might be in Europe. Okay, so there's going to be, of course, the process of export kind of trade that mercantilism, of course, brought into being. That is what mercantilism is. That again, you trade. This is how you create wealth. So this is one of the first principles or characteristics of this rising economic system. And the other one, of course, is the gold standard. Okay, so mercantilism also introduced the idea that gold was very valuable and it was the source of wealth. It was money, in other words. This is what ultimately will make anybody wealthy. Okay, so again, the gold standard is now accepted as the monetary system of mercantilism, the gold, that is to say. And of course, as we move forward into the 1500s, silver will also be added to that standard as well. As gold initially was the most important. Initially, it will remain so as well. So this is how merchants are going to engage in trade all over the regions in which there's commercial exchange. In that, if you're trying to buy merchandise, you pay with gold. I mean, if you cannot bring merchandise and trade it for some other merchandise, that's no problem, because ultimately you can just buy it with gold. It will be accepted everywhere. Everybody will accept that you can trade merchandise for gold, because ultimately that's what merchants are seeking, gold. The more gold you make, the wealthier you become. That gold can be used for investment, to expand your enterprise, etc. For many different ventures, if you will. Okay, that is money, in other words. This is considered to be money in Asia, whether we're talking about China, India, the Middle East, Europe, of course. So this is the method of payment for international trade, the gold standard. All right, so I mentioned just a moment ago how mercantilism international trade and itself uh, initiated the changes that today we're so accustomed and so take it for granted again, in that we live, for example, today in the modern world, in the modern age. We have a commercial economy, for example. We have social classes. People produce for the market. You know, the vast majority are trying to produce for the market, produce something so they can sell it, so they can make money, etc., etc. So our world, what we call the modern world, um, initiated back in the 1400s with mercantilism. Mercantilism initiated the early modern world. The early modern world. It laid the foundation for the rise of a new economic system that will ultimately replace feudalism in Europe. And it will start replacing feudalism elsewhere around the world, gradually over the centuries, that is to say. So even again, mercantilism is considered to be the forerunner, if you will, of capitalism. It was not capitalism per se, but it was like a bridge between feudalism and capitalism. It was like a middle stage that made the transition possible towards capitalism, that is to say. Okay? Why is that? Well, I mean, when you look at the 1400s, even into the 15 and 1600s in Europe, what mercantilism is doing is that it's changing everything connected to the economy. What people knew about the economy itself, for example, under feudalism, agriculture was a very, very simple type of endeavor, in that what people did back in feudal Europe was simply grow the food that they needed in order to subsist, self-subsistence, farming. People are growing simply, again, the wheat, the vegetable that they need to survive and to sustain their families, pretty much. But now, since there is an incentive under mercantilism that, look, you can create wealth with trade. So that means that there might be something you can grow in the land that might not necessarily be food, or it can be a foodstuff as well, but something that will be valuable for somebody, maybe not in your own town, but abroad. So you can ship it, you can export it, you can sell it, you can make money. So again, the traditional use of the land, what we call subsistence farming, is going to transition into what is called commercial agriculture, the commercialization of agriculture. In other words, let's grow something that we can sell. Okay? Yeah, it's true. I mean, we are going to continue growing our own food, but if you have additional land, if you happen to have additional land besides the land you use to grow your own food, you want to make money. You want to turn that land into an enterprise itself, called, commercial agriculture. Okay, so certain agricultural products were becoming commodities during this time. I mentioned, for example, in the Far East, things like spices and teas, for example. There will be yet other plants that are being commercialized during this time in the 13 or 1400s, and that's sugar, for example, as well. So what that meant is that now landowners, particularly merchants, are now trying to get land in order to grow cash crops, something that they can sell, including food. So you might want to just grow food and sell it on the market, again, for sale, again, in your own region, etc. So they don't have to be necessarily exotic products, even growing food for commercial purposes, not just to feed people, not just to feed your own family, but rather you want to create a commercial farm. So you want to maximize production, maximize output, try to grow as much crops and actually make money from them and trade them again. So again, we're moving towards what is called cash crop agriculture. Cash crop. In other words, you want to grow crops that are worth cash. So again, this is an early stage towards capitalism. Mercantilism brought that idea that you don't have to just continue the traditions of the past under feudalism of simply growing your own food to subsist, but rather, you can actually generate wealth from the land. You can make it productive, in other words. So just try to look for a cash crop. In other words, crops that are worth gold. Somebody will pay gold. Somebody's going to pay you silver for that crop, either because they need food or because they want an exotic luxury item. Might be sugar, for example. The Portuguese and the Spanish are going to be, again, looking for land to grow sugar, for sugar production. And this is how slowly but surely the Europeans are beginning to change the nature of agriculture and turn it into a business. Okay, so very gradually. Okay, so again, the changes are not taking overnight from one decade to the other, but rather this is a gradual process, a transition stage, again, towards capitalism, which, again, capitalism pretty much turned almost every activity into an enterprise itself. Any human activity can be turned into an enterprise if there's a market for that, if somebody is willing to buy the product or service that you produce. Again, you're in business, that is to say. So it's a business world in which we live in today, of course. And this business world, business-oriented world, started back in the 1400s with mercantilism. So this is going to give rise in Europe to the plantation. The plantation was, as I mentioned a moment ago, what the Portuguese and the Spanish are creating to grow sugar. So the plantation itself is a commercial enterprise. It's an agricultural enterprise in which people grow a certain cash crop for export purposes. It's exclusively 100% again for export-led purposes. So this is very different from a farm, that is to say. A plantation is different from a farm because the farm, people for the most part grow foodstuffs. Food, something that you actually need to survive. Grain and vegetables and so on. And they can be grown to feed a family, to feed a community, to feed a region, if you will. Okay, so in once again, farms grow exclusively foodstuffs, food, something that you actually need to survive. But in a plantation, for the most part, people grow exotic plants, that are not necessarily for basic needs. You don't need sugar to survive. I mean, it's a luxury item. Of course, it adds very good flavor to our pastries and our desserts, etc. Yes, it's true. But you really don't need sugar to live, of course. Later on, we're going to see that in the Americas, the plantation will be used to grow things like coffee, things like tobacco. Again, do you really need that? No, but again, those are luxury items. So that's what a plantation is, by the way. And this is going to be a mercantile enterprise. The plantation is mercantile because what is grown in the plantation is for export. The consumers of that product are abroad, overseas, and this is something that will be shipped to other regions of the world. Again, what the plantation is doing, that is to say. So it's a mercantile enterprise. It's for trade, for international trade. That's what mercantilism is international trade, that is to say. Okay? So this is, again, extremely important, that how mercantilism is really laying the groundwork, the foundation for the rise of capitalism slowly but surely, and the birth of the early modern world. This is how slowly but surely the modern world is going to look like. And today, agriculture is totally an enterprise. Totally. There's very few farmers that are simply just growing whatever food they need to survive. I mean, there are, but they're, a small percentage. The vast majority are are doing it for as an enterprise. So, second, we're going to see also another change taking place in Europe, and that is the rise of the merchant class. The merchant class used to be part of the commoners under feudalism. Remember, commoners were all groupings of society that were not part of the Lord protectors, the class of the lords, in other words, the protectors like the knights, the kings, and so on and so forth. So they were just commoners, like artisans and peasants and herders, and the merchants were just another grouping of the commoner class, and there were very few. There were just a handful of merchants in every town, but now this situation is going to change dramatically with the rise of international trade, because more and more people in Europe are going to see in trade as a new opportunity to increase their status, to increase their wealth. So they're going to make every effort, every sacrifice as possible to join the merchants in their ventures, to help them bring spices and so on and so forth, and to partner up with them in every possible way, and risk their lives in missions in which they had to travel long distances, bring spices, and so on and so forth. And slowly but surely, we're going to see the rise of more individuals that themselves are becoming merchants, and as such, the merchants themselves are going to create their own associations of merchants that help each other in any given town, and that association became known as the guilds. Like a guild is see it like a kind of like a today what we call a chamber of commerce, something similar to a chamber of commerce is. And that chamber of commerce is really just like an association of different merchants from the same city or the same town that meet from time to time to discuss problems or help each other develop strategies, so nobody's falling behind, so they can help each other, etc. Again, the mutual help kind of association, if you will. The guilds were trying to establish prices. In other words, look, let's not create competition here. We should all profit. So let's agree which prices are going to be, for the spices, etc., the products that we're bringing. Let's establish a price so we don't compete so heartlessly with each other, and so we can actually stay all in business, that is to say. So we see that, again, the emergence of guilds. Eventually, of course, some of those guilds are going to evolve into companies. Again, the very first stages of what today the modern day company is arising in the 14 and 1500s, and will continue to be formed in the coming centuries, of course, afterwards. The companies, that is to say, back then they were called the joint stock companies. Joint stock means that merchants who had significant wealth, who had been building wealth for a few generations based on trade, are now coming together, each sharing a share of their wealth in order to blend it or mix it with the wealth of other merchants to create a larger group, a larger entity. And instead of just one merchant being the owner, you're going to have, of course, a partnership here. It's a company in which there might be 2, 3, or more owners. And with that, the company is going to have a farther, reach in terms of what they can do. They're going to actually create larger and larger business ventures in terms of sending people to the Middle East for trade, to bring spices. They are now, again, investing a lot of money, again, in those expeditions. They want to bring more cargo and so on and so forth. So they want to share risks. They share investments. and they're also going to share profits. By the way, they're going to share the profits. So again, we're going to see the rise of joint stock companies in places like Italy, in places like Portugal. Eventually, they're going to spread across Western Europe in places like France, for example, Holland, and also in England. Again, over time, we're going to see the rise of joint stock companies, by the way. So, very important. Again, this is another very important development, a very important change. Modern finance, some merchants are simply lending some of the money. They have gold, they have silver, they have accumulated from their trading ventures, and they're going to use that in order to finance operations, to lend it to other merchants who are investing, for example, in expeditions or in cargoes that they want to bring from the Mediterranean Ocean, or spices and so on and so forth. And also, they're going to lend money to princes and monarchs as well. So whenever a monarch or a prince needed money, and very quickly, they're going to turn to a merchant. So back then there were no banks, okay? And when we talk about the 1400s, there were no banks per se in the modern sense of the word. So if you needed money, you go to a merchant, okay? You go to a merchant. And those merchants had the capital, if you will, had the money to lend it very easily and quickly to the monarch or to the prince, and and they're going to eventually turn their lending services into an enterprise that we call banking, of course, over time. So even the birth of modern finance is coming into being during this time, again, in the 1400s, that is to say, in Italy. Particularly in Italy, the Italian merchants, some of them are actually going into finance, and they're going to create modern finance in the process, of course. Now, having said that, at some point, of course, the merchant class are going to earn certain rights that separated them from the rest of the commoner class. In other words, they're going to be treated with certain special privilege, if you will, by their monarchs, by their princes. And why is that? As I mentioned again in the previous point, it is precisely because they provided very valuable services to the monarchs, to the princes, in terms of lending them money, etc., whenever they need it. So because a lot of princes and a lot of monarchs are now so-called indebted, if you will, to those merchants, so in return, the monarchs and the princes have to make certain concessions to those merchants and treat them, differently. So they were granted with certain rights, in other words, by their own kings, by their own princes. They were given a charter of rights. They earned certain rights. They were given the rights to pretty much govern the towns in which they live. Remember, we're talking about the Chamber of Commerce, the merchants, the guilds. So some of those merchants, again, are going to earn those rights, and they're going to be given the possibility here, the right to actually govern the town itself, what we call self-rule. So the merchants are going to be making decisions in their own town, political decisions, and in many cases, economic decisions as to, for example, how many taxes the town will have to pay to the prince, and so on, rules of trade, etc., or laws that needed to be passed, again, whether political laws, etc., of various kinds. Those are not going to be dictated by the prince or the monarch in that town, but rather the monarch is just giving the merchants the right to govern the town, as long as the town remains loyal and connected, of course, to the king. So this is the beginning of stages of what we call a Bill of Rights, okay, a charter of rights, if you will. The merchants are the ones pioneering this kind of change, precisely because of the significant role they played again in the kingdom or in the realm. Okay, over time, as we'll see, I mean, once America, of course, is going to be discovered by the Europeans, those joint stock companies that the merchants created, in which many of those merchants had already earned certain rights for self-rule, they're going to create larger and larger entities, what we call charter companies. And charter companies are simply companies that are going to operate overseas. That is to say, they're not going to operate within the kingdom in which they live, but rather as the Europeans are settling and colonizing America after Columbus discovered America in 1492, the king is going to charter one of those companies within the kingdom, those joint stock companies, commission them, give them a legal right to operate in America on behalf of the king. In other words, we're going to send you over there to establish a colony, and the colony is going to export certain products that the king is going to use for trade. In other words, the colonies are going to pretty much generate the commodities, the products that the kings are trading. And in order to do that, the king is going to actually commission the merchants, their companies, give them a charter. A legal charter, again, is give them the legal right to exist outside of the kingdom and operate on the other end of the world. It can be in America or else anywhere, again, on behalf of the king. Okay, so those merchants are not independently operating in America. They're not independent. They're operating as subjects, again, of the king, and they have the duty and obligation to export everything they produce back to the mother country, again, to the kingdom from which they came. Okay, so this is very important, that even the merchants are going to play a key role in the colonization of America, as we'll see, because many of the colonies that will be established, a great many, are going to be charter companies. Again, and they're not just going to be settlements by colonists, but rather they had a legal a legal framework, a legal constitution in which they were operating as an economic entity. They were operating as a company, and they had a charter. They had a legal right to conduct those operations, again, in America. So again, the other, of course, aspect of mercantilism, again, that is changing Europe, again, is that mercantilism is also transforming the states, the traditional states of Europe that were simply agriculturally operated. We mentioned that under feudalism, the monarchies were simply collecting tribute from the peasantry in order to run the kingdom. That is to say, so those kingdoms did not really grow very much during the feudal age. They just didn't, because there was not a lot of revenues coming into the treasury. It was just agricultural products that every year, those monarchies were collecting in tribute. But now, the monarchies of Europe, certain kingdoms, realized that there was an alternative source of revenue that could make the kingdom grow. And that alternative source of revenue that could bring far more wealth, more monies into the treasury, and make the kingdom grow economically, was trade. So the traditional kingdoms of Europe are going to now try to create, of course, that change in which they want to participate in trade, and in the process they will be becoming trading empires. Okay, so from simple kingdoms in Europe, we're going to see the transformation of those simple kingdoms into now trading empires, empires based on trade, that is to say, based on commercial exchange. That started out with Portugal in the 14 and 1500s, but as we move forward in time, in the 1700s, of course, we're going to see Spain coming in, also dominating, again, aspects of international trade: Holland, France, and England. Those are going to be the primary, again, trading empires that will rise to prominence and that will be able to dominate, again, significant regions of the globe in this process. Okay, they're going to compete, of course. They're going to be competing with each other for monopolizing trade, competing to control certain trade routes of the globe in which the commodities are flowing, the traffic, of course, and competing for markets, for consumers as well. So there's going to be intense competition between them. They're not going to be cooperating very much, but again, there's going to be, of course, that change as well. So again, Europe is really undergoing significant transformations in this process. All right, so now let's look at the discovery of America itself. Okay, so after we understand again mercantilism, now let us look at the process by which the Europeans are going to discover America, and in this case, of course, we're talking about Spain. So how this process occurred is that the Italians and the Portuguese merchants in the 1400s experienced significant difficulties conducting trade in the Middle East because the Mediterranean Ocean, the eastern portion of the Mediterranean Ocean in the Middle East, was now controlled by a new empire. There's the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, the Turks, okay, what they call the Turks. And of course, the conflict involved not only, of course, the control of the trade routes, the Ottomans really want to control the trade, the spice trade, if you will, and in many cases deprive the Europeans of that commodity, but others words is religious. Europe is Christian, Catholic, and in the Middle East, of course, the Turks are Islamic, of course. So it's not only an economic, of course, tension, an economic competition, but also religious, of course. So trade becomes interrupted. The Italian and Portuguese merchants find it more and more difficult to obtain the spices from India. So therefore, from 1434 to 1487, the Portuguese are going to accelerate their missions, their explorations to reach the Asian markets by navigating around Africa. Okay, so every year, again, you can see that again in those decades of the 1400s, every year they're sending ships in order to explore the water so they can navigate further and further and further and further and further south. Again, so by the 1480s, they had reached the southern tip of Africa, but still there was a long way to go. Continue their journey, of course. And in many cases, they will run out of food, they will run out of supplies, they will have to come back, of course. But now they're very desperate because this international trade has become interrupted. So due to that fact, Christopher Columbus, of course, somebody who had obtained his degree in the Portuguese schools of navigation. He was an Italian navigator who was a graduate of the Portuguese schools of navigation, was thinking of an alternative route to China, an alternative route to India. And that is that instead of going around Africa, he really believed that he could just sail to the west across the Atlantic Ocean and just get to Asia by doing that again. So he was convinced about that, thinking that the world was round. Still, the masses during this time in Europe believed that the world was not round but rather flat. So again, Christopher Columbus is suggesting something different, something else. And so he's going to be looking for a grant, so to speak, financial aid from the different monarchs of Europe in order to be given assistance. So so he could actually make the trip. In other words, he didn't have the resources. He did not have the ships or a crew or supplies to make this expedition. So his expedition was primarily scientifically motivated. So after going across Europe and petitioning financial aid, he finally found a positive response from the Spanish kings Isabella and Ferdinand. Those were the kings, the monarchs of Spain that ruled together as a marriage. And they were given, of course, Isabella and Ferdinand, gave Columbus everything he needed, of course, to make the expedition, with the promise that if Columbus reached the Asian markets, of course, those discoveries were going to be credited for Spain. In other words, Spain will take the credit, and Spain will deserve the access, the control, the monopoly of the trade routes, of the lands that Columbus will discover. Remember, I mean, that was the arrangement, the agreement. So again, in 1492, he set sails again to the so-called Far East across the Atlantic, and in this journey, after 3 months or so, he's going to reach land, of course, and that is, he found new land, the discovery of America in 1492. He arrived to a group of islands initially that he explored, the islands of Hispaniola. Today they're called Santo Domingo or the Dominican Republic, and also the Bahamas. He's pretty much, exploring those islands, and he comes back to Spain to give the news that he had found the land that the Europeans were looking for. Initially, he's thinking he arrived to India. And so he said, I announced that, I found Asia in this journey. So that's what he announced. And of course, he took natives with him as proof. When he returned back to Spain, he actually took some natives from those Caribbean islands, saying, look, they're Indians, of course. So again, the term Indian is going to stick on the indigenous peoples of America because Columbus mistook them for India. Again, he had arrived to India. Of course, he's going to return and make 3 additional journeys. And when he actually returns, it is when not only Columbus, but other navigators that are coming are going to realize that what Columbus found was not necessarily Asia, but it was a new land, by the way. And nobody had an idea of, the size and the scope of this newfound land. Nobody knew. Nobody had an idea. There were no maps. So this land had to be explored. So once again, Columbus makes 4 total journeys, 4 voyages. And in those voyages, he's exploring the Caribbean islands, parts of Central America, and parts of South America on the coastline. And in fact, he really wanted to find a passage. He really wanted to find some form of canal, a waterway to continue navigating across, the Americas and into China in the Far East. He really wanted that. But at any rate, so again, Columbus's voyages and his discovery of America initiated a new age in human history, and this age is called the Age of Encounters. Okay, the Age of Encounters begins. What is the Age of Encounters? So the discovery of America was simply the first step towards the meeting of the cultures, the peoples, the civilizations of the world. Europeans were exploring bodies of water around Africa. In many cases, they're arriving to Africa. They have to make a stop. They have to actually recharge, resupply food, and ask that food, that supply from the local populations of Africa. So again, Europeans are meeting Africans. They're also doing trade in the Middle East. They're meeting the peoples of the Middle East as well, more constantly. Now they have found the indigenous peoples of America. So the indigenous peoples of America are going to now discover, if you will, that there are other peoples populating the globe. The Europeans, in this case. The Europeans find the indigenous peoples. So over time, when the Portuguese will finally reach India, the peoples of India see the Portuguese, and the Portuguese will continue to navigate all around, Asia into China, and the Chinese see Europeans, and back and forth. So this is a meeting of all of the people of the world. Okay, and what made that leap possible? The engine of that was trade. In other words, trade motivated explorers, motivated kings, motivated merchants, motivated navigators like Columbus to really set sail and try to find routes by which they could accelerate trade. So trade was the motivator of all of the people that were involved, again, in this process of discovery and exploration, and eventually the discovery of a new world, America. And the meetings of peoples, of course, is taking place as a result of Europeans and others trying to accelerate the pace of international trade, in other words, of course. So this age of encounters also initiated something called, in global history, the Columbian exchange. So what is the Columbian exchange? So the Columbian exchange is simply that in those encounters, people are going to be exchanging back and forth ideas that have been formulated for thousands of years, religious ideas, scientific ideas, technologies, for example, tools that they had created, and they're going to share them with one another. And some of them are going to be appropriating the ideas of other peoples and making them their own, for example, or like the Europeans are bringing Christianity, for example, to the New World. Again, Native Americans are going to see for the first time another religion, other gods, other goddesses, other ways of counting time, the European calendar, for example, European languages. But at the same time, this Columbian exchange involved the exchange of different animal and plant species. In other words, that as Europeans come to America, they're going to bring certain animals and plants that were not indigenous to America. Like, for example, cattle, the horse, for example, okay, hens, pigs, goats, sheep, okay, those animals were not present in America, and they're going to become now part of the diet, if you will, of the landscape, of the geography of America. They're also going to bring wheat, for example, rice. Wheat and rice was not indigenous to the Americas, but rather also the indigenous peoples of America are also going to offer, of course, plants that were not present in Europe or all over the world, like corn. Corn will be exported out of America and it will be adopted all over the world. Things like chilies, chocolate, for example, as well. Potatoes, tomatoes, for example. And again, those are plants that were only grown in the Americas, and now they're going to be grown everywhere. So the meaning of this is that the cultures of the world are all going to change as a result of this Columbian exchange. That the cultures of the world that had developed pretty much in isolation from other cultures, pretty much developing their own way of life, their own ideas, their own technologies, etc., they're now in a process of rapid change because they're now influenced by the ideas, the animals, the plants that are coming, that are flowing from different parts of the world into their own societies. And so those cultures are becoming more and more hybrid. Even today, the cultures of the world are very, very mixed, very, very hybrid. They're not as they existed before Columbus. When you see anywhere around the world, when you see a culture, it's very rare that you'll say this culture is pure, because this culture has not suffered any change. It's exactly the way as this culture was formed thousands of years ago. It will be very, very rare to find such a culture. Not that it will be impossible, but you probably have to find them in remote areas of the globe. And in Australia, in the forest of the Amazons in South America, again, you might find some of them like that. Okay, all right. Okay, so we still have about 20 minutes. I think it's gonna give us enough time. All right, so now let's look at part two, the conquest. I think we have enough time to actually conclude the conquest. There's just an analysis of the conquest as opposed to telling an entire story about the stages in which the conquistadors landed in central Mexico and South America, and of course engaged in the battles, etc. So it's very interesting and is very important to note that. But what we're going to be doing here is really just providing an overview and an analysis of the conquest itself, just to understand why, in this case, the Spaniards were able to conquer the Aztecs, for example, of central Mexico, the Aztec Empire of central Mexico, and the Inca Empire of South America with such a small force. In that, in any given case, the Spaniards did not really number more than 1,000 soldiers in each one of those cases, and even less. Again, in South America, it was less than 200 soldiers, versus, again, the monumental number of Aztec warriors, again, that battle against them in central Mexico, or the Inca warriors in South America. So how is it that such a small force of soldiers were able to subdue those two empires? Again, so when we talk about the conquest, we're talking about the Spanish conquest, because they're the first ones arriving. They're the ones that, again, are going to claim credit for Columbus's discoveries, and they're the ones actually arriving first before all the other Europeans to explore the islands of the Caribbean and to start exploring the American continent, the mainland. And in the process, they're going to be meeting, of course, indigenous societies, some of which were already in the stage of imperialism. Okay, so there were not just tribal societies or small villages that they encounter. In some cases, they were very well developed societies that had evolved into what today we call empires, like the Aztecs of Mexico and the Incas of Peru in South America. So again, the Aztec Empire was located in the Central Valley of Mexico, and it stretched for hundreds and hundreds of miles in both directions. The capital was in Tenochtitlan, what today is, of course, Mexico City. And again, their sphere of influence, their control stretched all the way to what today is present-day San Luis Potosí, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, parts of Oaxaca today, Michoacán, all the way to areas of what today is Chiapas and Guatemala as well. So vast landed empire, of course, that was built around 1260, and is going to start collapsing once the Spaniards arrive in 1519, and there will be an intense battle between the Spaniards and the Aztecs between 1519 and 1521. So in only a matter of 2 years, the Aztec Empire is going to collapse, of course, in only 2 years of battle, in which the Spaniards were able to subdue them in only 2 years of fight. The Inca Empire to the south, of course, stretched for thousands of miles, in the western coast of South America. Pretty much on the coastline, you can see that the vast Inca Empire was located there with dozens and dozens of different cities. Of course, it also had a capital as well, ruled by an emperor who was considered to be divine, just like the Aztec emperor, by the way. And when the Spaniards arrived in 1532, they're going to also engage in battle with the Inca warriors, and in only 4 years, by 1536, the Inca Empire was defeated. Of course, there will be resistance. Of course, and after that, there will be years and years of sporadic, if you will, resistance of Incas still battling the Spaniards. But that resistance was really just localized, if you will, in certain communities, etc. But again, the emperor had died by 1536, and the capital was taken, and of course, the fight was over by 1536. So again, what are the lessons of the conquest? This is what I was referring to, what we can learn. In other words, what enabled the conquistadors, the Spaniards, to conquer the Aztecs and the Incas with such a small force. And when they were actually in an unknown territory away from home, and what enabled them to actually conquer those societies, which were very developed and that had hundreds of thousands of people, large populations, and large military forces as well. So it begs the question, let's just understand very quickly what enabled the conquistadors to accomplish that feat. So number one, of course, we have to look at the geography, of course, of Europe and the geography of America. And this is going to be, again, a central point in the lessons of the conquest, in that when you look at the geography of Europe and America, they're so different in that the geographies shaped the technologies that the Europeans had versus the technologies that the Native Americans had. And in this case, we're talking about steel. Steel comes from the landscape. Okay, in Europe, steel was developed for not only centuries but for thousands of years. The Europeans have developed steel due to the fact that the European continent, the geography, was blessed with plenty of iron ore deposits. Again, iron ore is the mineral that you need in order to build steel. Okay, and again, it was abundant. You couldn't just mine it from the surface of the land, and there's no need to introduce machinery and look for it, of course, underneath the surface of the earth. It was plentiful and it was everywhere. So Europeans could just simply take that mineral, learn how to smelt it, and by smelting the iron ore, they could create iron works, many of which are going to be used for different types of endeavors, like farming tools, but also for warfare, by the way. So when you look at the geography, for example, again, of Europe, explains why the Europeans had access to steel for steel weaponry, and the Native Americans did not. The Native Americans did not have iron ore easily available to them on the surface of the earth. In America, iron ore is hidden from sight, is really underneath the earth itself, so you have to mine it. In other words, you need to introduce mining equipment, etc. Something that we can do today, of course, with modern technology. But back then, it was really literally impossible to get at that iron ore. Again, so the geography of America was different from the geography of Europe, which, again, Europe, the Middle East, Asia, had a lot of iron ore easily available. And therefore, this is the reason why Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, and parts of South Africa developed steel technologies. Those were the steel civilizations, as they're called, the steel civilizations. They entered the Iron Age very early on in world history. And the reason for that, as I said, is the geography is providing the raw materials to you. It provides the elements from which people are going to actually take those elements and create tools. And in America, again, Native Americans just didn't see it on the surface, so therefore they're not going to create iron works. They're not going to enter the Iron Age. There will be no steel technology for, again, tools of warfare. And so, again, the weaponry of the Native Americans was no match for the weaponry of the Europeans. The Spanish brought things like swords, shields, armors, muskets that they had built for hundreds of years, of course. And Native Americans were still using a Stone Age technology in which most of their weapons, again, were made from rocks and stones, etc. Yeah, they had very, very sharp blades that they crafted, of course, etc. Axes, bows and arrows. But when you consider, for example, the shields, the swords, etc., of the Spanish, there was no match for that. So again, first and foremost, the geography is changing or shaping, I should say, the kind of technologies that people develop that will enable them to encounter challenges as they, for example, the Spanish leave Europe, go to America. They meet the challenge of the Aztecs, but they overcome that challenge because they have, of course, a technology that their geography provided the raw materials of, in other words, in Europe. Okay, so epidemics. This is another aspect of the geography. What do I mean about that? Well, epidemics are also a byproduct of the geography. In what way? Well, because most epidemics originate from, of course, bacteria, in this case, of course, microbes, like viruses, etc., parasites that exist in the organisms of animals, okay? So it is the animal that transmits that microorganism, whether you call it a virus, etc., to people. And once that virus, which existed in the animal but did not kill the animal, was transferred into the human organism, the organism, of course, enters into shock, and sometimes it dies in this case. So it is really the animal species of the geography that will be responsible for human epidemics. So why is this the product of geography? Because the geography of Europe provided certain animals that people domesticated. They had been domesticating for thousands of years. And in this domestication, this interaction between humans and animals, the animals began to transmit those microorganisms, those viruses to people, and we say the outbreaks of epidemics, of course, in Europe for literally hundreds and hundreds of years. The same happened in Africa, the same happened in Asia. There's certain species of animals over there like cattle, there's, again, horses that people domesticated, pigs, hens, for example, that people had domesticated from the wild and, of course, brought them to live close to them. And that, of course, had generated human epidemics for literally thousands of years. Things like smallpox or chicken pox comes from chicken, yellow fever from cattle, from horses as well, measles, tuberculosis, likewise, and malaria from mosquitoes. So it is the animal that is transmitting, of course, the microorganism to the human beings when the human beings are interacting more closely, more directly with those species. So the significance of this, of course, as we'll see, is that Native Americans do not have those species of animals. They don't have cattle. They don't have pigs or hens or goats or sheep that they're domesticating. If they need an animal, they go out and hunt it, and that's pretty much about it. But they're not living close to the animals, so they're not going to be exposed to the epidemics of the old world. Okay, now epidemics in the ancient world happened in a very localized manner. Whenever there was an epidemic, it actually happened in a little town, maybe a little village. It will spread maybe to a neighboring village. They were very localized. But with the rise of international trade in the 1300s that we were speaking about, and the role of international trade made the spread of epidemic disease far and wide. Again, so instead of being localized, the merchants that are moving into one society and trading and bringing merchandise back to their own town, throughout this trade, in all of the networks and all of the villages that the merchants are crossing, if somebody gets sick, again, in any of them, the merchant is going to spread unwillingly, of course, and unknowingly, the disease. And so we're going to see an outbreak again in regions and, in fact, across continents, of course, with the rise of international trade. So people are not just trading commercial goods anymore, or they're not just trading ideas. With trade, people are also trading germs. That is to say, okay. So, having said that, of course, before the arrival of the Spaniards, of course, the Europeans had suffered, of course, the effects of pandemics. Again, a pandemic is an epidemic disease that spreads pretty much far and wide across several regions and pretty much across the world. The Black Death, it was called the bubonic plague. This is something that started back in northern China in the 1300s, spread across China, and spread into India through the trading networks, the merchant trails, with the spice trade, for example, the silk trade, the Silk Roads, and it spread into Europe, because of the spice trade as well, the commercial revolution. And once it entered Europe, of course, Europeans are going to be largely affected by the bubonic plague, something that actually started in northern China, is now coming into Europe in the late 1300s, mid 1300s, and this is going to decimate 50% of the European population. 50% of Europeans are going to die from the bubonic plague. So even before the arrival of the Spaniards to the New World, Europeans had already suffered, a great pandemic that decimated half of the population of Europe, by the way. So this is the byproduct, of course, in that we're going to see that when the Spaniards arrive, and they're going to arrive to an area that was isolated. Again, the New World, the Americas, was disconnected from the rest of the world. Native Americans had not been exposed to the diseases of other peoples from the Europeans or the Asians and Africans and so on. And they had no animals that they had domesticated also that enabled them to gain some form of resistance or immunity from exposure to the, again, microorganisms of the animals. So therefore, with the contact with the Europeans, what we're going to see is that the Aztecs and the Incas, in this case, are going to suffer great losses, not necessarily from warfare, from the technologies that the Spanish brought, but rather because they enter into contact with things like yellow fever and smallpox, and of course people began to die in great numbers. So this is something that weakened the Aztec and the Inca empires from within, in that they just simply did not have the immunity, again, to the diseases that we're now being exposed to. So 90% of the Native American population will decrease from 1492 to 1650, and after 1650, the Native American population will recover. So by 1650, Native Americans are now gaining immunity, and they're beginning to now more and more survive, if you will, episodes of yellow fever and smallpox, because they have now developed some form of resistance after this. Okay, so at any rate, now, of course, just a few minutes here. Now, there's the role of Native American religious ideas, of course, as well, that a lesson of the conquest, and that is that also another reason why the Aztecs and the Incas were conquered by the Spaniards is because they had certain religious ideas in which they believed that defeat was unavoidable, that they had to accept defeat, because in the case of the Aztecs had certain calendars. They were very, very, very governed by the cycles of time, and they believed that whatever happened in a past cycle will reemerge in a future cycle. So many of the prophecies that they had were based on calendars, that is to say, calendar prophecies. And they believed that since an ancient god known as Quetzalcoatl came to the world in particularly one year, called year one read of their calendar, there's a 52-year calendar, so 1 year called one read. The announcement is that whenever you see one read happening in that 52-year cycle, Quetzalcoatl might appear. Okay, and he's going to appear coming from the east, and when he comes, he's going to destroy the Aztecs. That was the prophecy of Quetzalcoatl again. this is very, very, again, mysterious, because when Cortés, the conquistador, Hernan Cortés, showed up in the shores of Veracruz on April 22nd, 1519, the Spanish conquistador, he was exploring the Gulf of Mexico, and he heard about the Aztecs, so he wanted to meet the Aztecs. When the Aztecs saw him, descend from those ships on the coastline, many people believe he was Quetzalcoatl because he arrived in year one read. He arrived in the same year that the prophecies had announced the return of Quetzalcoatl. And the prophecy said he's going to return to destroy the Aztecs. So a lot of Aztecs believe that that was a heavenly sign. In other words, look, Quetzalcoatl, Cortés, the conquistador, might or might not be Quetzalcoatl himself, but he is a representative. Maybe he's an ambassador. Maybe he's Quetzalcoatl himself. So it's inevitable. The coincidence, if you will, of having a prophecy said, look, in year one read, Quetzalcoatl will show up from the east, and now suddenly there's ships arriving, people looking very differently with shiny armors, etc., arriving on the same year where Quetzalcoatl was supposed to appear. For many Aztecs was no coincidence. So many Aztecs, including the leadership, believed that, again, that the prophecy was going to be fulfilled, that the Aztecs were going to be destroyed. So it was inevitable. So psychologically speaking, a lot of people accepted in the Aztec Empire, the leadership, particularly the emperor, accepted defeat, that they cannot battle the god. We're not going to win because this individual is a god. He's sent by the gods, in other words. And this is the return of Quetzalcoatl. He returns to destroy us, in other words. So that's very important. And also the Inca of South America, the Incas of what's called Peru today, also believed in their religion in returning white thunder gods. In other words, that the thunder gods were white, and that they were also returning from time to time to restore their kingdom, in other words. Okay, so when they saw, the Spaniards approaching, even though there were no more than 200 soldiers, many people really believed that those were the thunder gods. And of course, when they heard the roar of the muskets that they brought, it was like the thunder. Okay, so they were convinced that those were the thunder gods, in other words. And that also was a psychological factor that convinced a lot of the Inca leadership and warriors, of course, that this is the end, because gods are appearing. They might be ancestors or ghosts. In other words, this is a supernatural thing that is occurring. They have never seen Europeans. They have never seen a horse. They have never seen the weaponry. So they believe that they were witnessing was something supernatural. In other words, this is a magical thing happening. And of course, you hear the roar of the musket. I mean, it was just so frightening. People were simply convinced that this was the end of their civilization, in other words. So in sum, the three lessons of the conquest is the conquest of the Aztecs and the Incas is the role of steel. By the way, please understand that steel, the development of steel, had nothing to do with creativity or intelligence, but rather geography. The geography provided the elements, the materials for people to build tools. Europeans built steel, and the Americans didn't. Epidemics is also a product of geography, because the epidemics come from animals. Again, the animal species. And there were animal species that were domesticated in Europe that did not exist in the Americas. So the Europeans had grown immune and resistant resistance to the diseases of those animals. But when they came to the Americas, again, because of trade, we're going to see also the spread of epidemic disease across the Native American population that in many cases weakened, of course, those empires from within. And of course, the role of Native American religious ideas in accepting defeat, like the Aztecs believing in the return of Quetzalcoatl. They believed Cortés, the conquistador, was Quetzalcoatl. So that created a condition of accepting defeat. And also the Incas in terms of seeing the Spaniards as the white thunder gods, their muskets, of course, as the roar of thunder. This is all I have for you. This is the end of our lecture. So when we come back, very quickly, we're just going to go into the colonization of the New World, and we're going to look at North America, particularly North America, in particular, in this case, Great Britain. This is going to be discussed thoroughly in session 3, but as for now, this is all I have for you for session 2. So next week, I'll send the third session. Okay, bye-bye.